My opponents,
Yeah.
my audience,
Yes.
and my partner.
Yep.
Just brief off-time roadmap. We're going to go over my opponent's case first and go over my own if I have time. So my opponent's point one is basically just a definition of what the Voter Rights Act is, so it's not an arguable point, so you have to drop that entirely. The point two, they said that it does not limit the minority electoral votes and whatnot, but laws that can be passed without the Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, which stops states that have a history of passing discriminatory laws. Without that, these states are being allowed to make laws that discriminate against minorities like the elderly, or women, and other minority groups. So, so it does obviously limits these people's right to vote and right to express their political opinions through voting. So their point two falls there. They also said in their point three that states should be treated equally, but we need to put the rights of the people above the rights of the states. While the Voting Rights Act did violate the 10th Amendment, it was found that it was needed to do so to stop discrimination back in 1965 after passing the strict scrutiny test, which is how they define whether or not something is allowed to violate the Constitution if it furthers the government and the people's goal as a whole. And without this law, the Voting Rights Act is the only thing that allows us to enforce the 15th Amendment and allow minority groups and other people to not be discriminated in voting. And Section 4 is specifically how we have the criterion of what states need to be watched more closely than others for these types of laws. So without the criterion, we can no longer enforce the Voting Rights Act. Thus, the entire 15th Amendment can't be enforced at all. So people will be able to be discriminated against in the voting booths. So that's why the Supreme Court's decision to strike down Section 4 is completely inept, really, because by doing so, they open up all these states, like, for example, as we said, Texas just passed voting ID law that is discriminating against the women. Even one of the judges of the state is currently having trouble being able to vote because of these papers that she didn't get really the memo for, because, these laws, while they're not being explicitly segregational, that's how racism has evolved in our country. It's no longer de jure. We are no longer segregating people by law. We're doing it de facto in practice by creating these laws that don't necessarily say minorities can't vote, but by creating laws that make it more difficult for them too. So by dropping the fourth section, the Supreme Court's basically opened us to the hounds of segregation in the voting booths. And also in their point 4, they said that Section 4 provides unequal protection, which it needs to be, because there are certain states that don't need quite as strict of trials to have to go through to pass these laws. For example, Idaho hasn't passed any segregational laws affecting voting, so they need less pre-clearance than a state like Mississippi, which has a long history of segregating against people in the voting booth. So that's why it's there, so that we can focus more on the places that need it and less on the places that don't, thus making it a more streamlined system to stop segregation in our country. And I'll go over my own case. So as we said, my opponent said, that this will lead to discrimination and dehumanization of people in the voting booths. If these states are allowed to suppress the people's right to vote, then it suppresses the people's right to really have an opinion in the political sphere at all, thus violating their First Amendment right to express their opinion, and also the Fifth Amendment right for anybody to be able to vote, the 21st Amendment for women being able to vote without any precursor tests and whatnot. So obviously by striking this down, all these other amendments are being violated, and we're violating the rights of the people in general. So the Supreme Court is obviously wrong in their decision of striking down this law. And for that reason, I only see a combat on this debate. Thank you. So did you know that the Voter Rights Act of 1965 was passed because the 15th Amendment was not being enforced?
That wasn't the case.
That was the case. That's
No,
exactly what the
why
Voter
it was
Rights Act was being passed.
is so they knew discrimination was there, they just didn't know where. And so
Well, I'm not talking about Section 4, I'm talking about the Voter Rights Act in general was created because people were being discriminated against and the 15th Amendment was not being enforced. So did you know that the Voting Rights Act as a whole was passed so they could actually enforce the 15th Amendment?
How does that work out?
Because although we passed the 15th Amendment allowing anybody to vote, as with the Jim Crow laws and whatnot in the South, people were still not being allowed to vote. So we passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to force states to not stop minorities from voting.
Do you know that minorities in the dictionary can actually be classified as minors, and minors are not allowed to vote because they're under 18?
But what about all the other minority groups like African Americans, women, Mexican Americans.
They're still allowed to vote without Section 4. All that will happen without Section 4 is states can say,
States can pass laws that can discriminate against these people because
They
they don't have to
can,
be pre-clearance,
but
right?
they can, but
So
we
wouldn't
don't
that
know
hurt
if they
the
will or
person's
they will
rights?
not. That's
But Texas and
that's the
Mississippi and
uncertainty
Florida are
of
already
it,
passing
is that
these laws, aren't they? Immediately after this.
that's one
Section
state out of
4.
50.
That was 3 states
passed-
I just named, and those are 3 of the states that are under pre-clearance, and other states like Louisiana are looking towards it as well. If anybody's being discriminated against, shouldn't we stop it? It doesn't matter if it's in one state or all the states. Discrimination
May I
in
ask
one
a
place
question?
and discrimination everywhere. It does not.
May I ask a question?
Yes, you may.
Okay, so you.
That's
Can I still ask a question? Okay, so during your case, you said that, if I'm correct, that Section 5 will stop discrimination, if I'm correct.
What we said was Section 5's goal is to the actual enforcement of it, but Section 4 was what backed it up by saying what areas needed to have the enforcement enacted.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. My partner at my office. The con has won this debate for 2 major reasons. One, we followed our resolution and analysis to a T, which says that has to explain why voting will function better with it active, as we've shown before, is that without the Section 4 being active, states are allowed to overstep their boundaries and create laws that can be discriminatory and make it harder or even impossible for minority groups, women, and the elderly from being able to vote, thus making it really impossible for them to express their political opinions at all, violating the First Amendment rights, violating the Fifth Amendment, which says that nobody will have to comply to a test or device by the states themselves to be able to vote, and also the 21st Amendment, which which allows women to vote without any hindrances as well. So we're impeding. So these states, without this clearance, will impede on the rights of the people, which is what this debate is about: is whether or not these states will impede on the rights of the people, which they will, as they have, as we said before. It's happening in Texas, happening in Florida, happening in Louisiana, and it's spreading to other states in the South who before would not be able to pass these discriminatory laws because of the pre-clearance provided by Section 4. As my opponent said before, is that Section 5 says that they can still go, that Congress won't let these laws pass. But 1, they already have, and 2, Congress can go in if these laws are put to trial in the states themselves. Then Congress can go in and try and change them with the help of the Supreme Court. But that can be a long and arduous process. And in the time between then and the time that they struck it down and the time that these things get fixed again, millions of people will be discriminated against in the voter booth. These people will not be allowed to vote, or the voting process will become much more difficult because of the Section 4 being stricken down, because these states will have the time to enact these laws that discriminate against them. For those reasons, we cannot put states' rights above human rights. We cannot put the 10th Amendment above these other amendments when the 10th Amendment, or when these states are impeding not only on the federal government's power to allow these people to vote for it, but also on the people's power to express their opinions in all forms, especially the voter booth. For that reason, I only see a con in this debate. Thank you.
Can we take some jail time?